Good? Okay. All right, hello. My name is Andrew Sega. In the demo scene, I'm known as Necros, and I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about tracking, which maybe some of you, I see some seniors and I see some non-seniors. Some of you may know, some of you may not. The demo scene basically involves three components. There's code, which is typically how programmers push the envelope. There's art, which is how artists push the envelope. And then there's music. And the demo scene has a very specific type of music, which we tend to call tracking. It was invented around 1987, and it sort of has become the de facto way you make music these days in the demo scene. Pretty much every single demo that exists on the PC specifically, and also on Amigas, uses tracked music. Even, believe it or not, things like 4K intros where you wouldn't think it'd be possible to actually fit music into something of that size. One of the big benefits of tracking also is that it's very self-contained. There's no reliance on sound generators, long MP3 files, WAV files, that sort of thing. And so it's a really unique form of music, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of where it came from and what you can do with it today in a professional sense. But first, we'll do a little bit of history. In 1982, there was the Commodore 64, which was a brilliant piece of machinery. And it had one of the first sound chips called the SID, which allowed you to actually do more than PC speaker beeping or Tandy 1000 sort of primitive chirping. And as we went through the years, there was the Amiga, there was ad-lib synthesis, multi-channel PC sound cards, advanced formats, and then nowadays you can pretty much do whatever you want. Stream MP3s, play multiple MP3s at once, compress to your heart's content. But to understand what tracking is and why you'd want to do things this way, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the history of the audio chip and what it can do. The Commodore 64 had this lovely device called the SID, and really, I forget the guy who invented it was from a prominent music company. I wish I could remember, actually. I just blanked. But it had 3 oscillators and 4 waveforms. It had things like ADSR, which is attack, decay, sustain. Basically, a note can sort of come on and fade out. It had an actual filter where you can sort of change the frequency of a sound. These are all things that were way ahead of the time for any sort of hardware. The songs had to, unfortunately, be programmed at a very low level because the Commodore 64 had no real high-level interface, like, say, a direct sound, and there was no support for samples. Your waveforms were all very simple. And to give you a taste of that, I'm going to play some Commodore 64 music. This first one is the sort of exhibits a very characteristic sound. This is the Pitfall 2 soundtrack. Very exciting. You can just make that go mono, by the way, if it's not coming out of both sides. This one is Rob Hubbard's Dragon's Lair 2. And then a little bit of Rob Hubbard's Skate or Die, which is one of the first Commodore 64 tracks to attempt to try to play something that resembled a sample. Very old school indeed. That guitar is ridiculously grainy because it was at a sample rate of like thousands of samples per second. And so it had limited realism. The waveforms were stock. It had a sort of a beep and a different beep. It had a noise oscillator, which could basically go, that's about it. And there was barely enough CPU to play back anything, much less a sample. As you heard, Skate or Die tried it at a really low rate. It sounds kind of like a guitar. People were, ooh. Then came this beautiful beast, the Amiga 1000. The Amiga 1000 had something very special. It had an audio chip which could play back samples in hardware. At the time, in 1985, this was unheard of. And it had, the hardware supported 4 playback channels, 8-bit samples, approximately 29 kilohertz. There was some weird issues with vertical sync and such, which affected the sample rate. But in general, it sounded great. And so this was also at the time where the demo scene was approaching sort of, as maybe you saw in Phoenix's talk, approaching some level of maturity. and people saw this audio hardware and said, hey, we need to really make some music on this. Thus, the first ever tracker, Carson Obarski, 1987, created something called Sound Tracker. It was also the first to use something called the mod format, which was basically note, sample, some effects that you could do sort of per channel. And it looked like that, and it had very simple editing capabilities. And it was sort of the first tool that you could actually use the Amiga to its full potential. And so people, all of a sudden, the demo scene embraced this, and we have some really interesting music coming out. As you will compare to the Commodore 64 stuff, here's some Amiga jams. This would be Space Debris from 1991. I forget what demo this was in. Maybe someone can remind me. Trickster. Was it not? I could have sworn this was in some Amiga demo. Okay. So you can hear it sounds like kind of real instruments. Here's another example, Heat Beats Aquarium People, featuring even more sort of a realistic sound. And for 1991, this was amazing. If you think what was on the PC around 91, there was basically ad-lib and beeping. And people who had Amigas could actually play stuff like this. Here's also another example of my favorite mod in the world, Dizzy's Banana Split. Which really sounds pretty awesome considering it is only literally 4 channels. Only 4 things can play at any one time. So, I guess I'll speak a little bit about what a tracker actually is. A tracker basically just means putting sounds into tracks. So the tracker is the editor. It's a very efficient sort of way to use the hardware of, say, something like an Amiga, which has a hardware sample playback. You just typed in notes, and it'd say C, A flat, and the octave number. Had a very low memory overhead, and for demo, it was perfect because the average file size of these songs was on the order of, hundreds of K. In the early days, perhaps 50 to 100 K. Later on, perhaps 500 K to a meg. But really efficient, didn't affect download sizes of productions. And so people really latched onto it. There are many flavors. As I showed you, the Ultimate Sound Tracker was the first, but soon came the clones, Pro Tracker, Fast Tracker, Octamed, 669, Composer, Scream Tracker, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What? Yeah, all sorts of good stuff. But they all basically operated the same way. You had samples, which were the sound files that got played. There were the channels, which mapped directly to the hardware and played samples. There was effects, which I'll talk a little bit more later, but they are basically per channel things you could do to change the sound, usually change the volume of a sound, pitch bend something, offset into a sample, and do various things. And then there was the pattern, which is basically how you organize the song as a whole. Unfortunately, the editors pretty much still look like this. This was Pro Tracker 3, 1992. And what you can kind of see here is 4 tracks. We have note row. This is sort of all compressed, but you had, these are essentially effects data where it would be an effects number and then a value. Again, I don't know why they love hexadecimal so much, perhaps because hexadecimal fits into 2 characters and avoids that nasty 3-character problem with numbers over 100. But musicians ate it up, perhaps because in these days, musicians, or pretty much anybody involved in the demo scene, had to have some sort of programming knowledge. Otherwise, you just couldn't get these productions done. And so, really, it's simpler than it looks. If you break down what you saw right there as the sort of combinations of rows, you can do 1 row at a time and look at it.